And welcome to the expert breakout sessions for Enterprise Integration Summit. This is the session for Neuron ESB, and rejoining us, Marty Wasznicky, Vice President. Marty, welcome back.
Vance, thanks for having us.
We are so glad to have Marty and Neuron ESB with us. Marty spearheads product innovation, solving customer challenges with hands-on application engineering insight with a focus on the .NET developer community. He has more than 22 years experience in enterprise software and integration. And notably for this session, he is a veteran of Microsoft's Connected Systems division, and he guides Neuron ESB's growth as the only enterprise integration platform based on the .NET development environment. The technology you'll see is a key to enable digital transformation and provide ease of data integration with cloud, legacy systems, and even external apps. In his session, Marty will bring all that expertise together. He'll explore .NET-based integration to meet the challenges of the digital enterprise. He'll tell us how enterprise integration using the .NET platform is a lot easier and full-featured than many may think. He'll explore how to use APIs to create easy-to-consume abstractions and expose business processes. And as I understand it, Marty, we'll even get a feature walkthrough of some of the cool Neuron ESB screens and features. Just a quick reminder, you can download Marty's slides. They're available. Just click the button underneath the viewing area. In that same region, you'll see that he and his team have brought some valuable white papers and other downloads. They're available for you today with one click, no extra registration. And we love to promote conversation with our speakers, so to connect with Marty, type in the submit a question box. Now, Marty, let me hand it back to you and tell us more about API's workflow and application integration for .NET developers.
I love it, Vance. Thanks. Let's take a moment and think about some of the challenges companies face today. A lot of them have multiple systems that do a variety of things like HR, payroll, supply chain management. Lots of cloud apps in that mix now, like Salesforce, Dynamics Online, NetSuite, and Workday. Lots of companies doing mergers and acquisitions. Lots of new systems. Lots of manual processes that they have to automate. And there's a lot of legacy systems that just simply aren't integrated today. I spoke with a pretty large, well-known retailer one time, and they were selling product on the web. But each morning, they'd have to go in, take those orders, and manually enter them into a green screen application for the mainframe. So it's just one of those reasons why companies right now are in the midst of modernization efforts. I still see that today. In any case, most want a 360-degree view of their business as well as their customers. And they want it in near real time, not the end of the week, right? So we see more and more people trying to move from that batch process to that real-time process. Because when they reach that state, they find that they can actually make better and more timely decisions that directly impact their bottom line. Now, the larger question, what exactly is an enterprise service bus? I think the label enterprise service bus, ESB, has really evolved into an overloaded term. Initially, years ago, we could say that an enterprise service bus was a software architecture for integration middleware. They provided some sort of fundamental service like messaging, routing, basic veto pattern support, as well as features that could facilitate SOA adoption. But most ESBs have really evolved over the years into full-blown integration brokers, just like Neuron ESB. Not surprising, since the services landscape has evolved just as much, which now includes RESTful services, or what we commonly refer to as APIs. There's easily more API-based service work done now than there is SOAP. I think SOAP has been mostly relegated to internal system integration scenarios where REST APIs tend to rule the roost for any type of cloud integration or external publication and access. For example, Neuron can host API and SOAP-based services, do it all the time. Developers can create an API or SOAP endpoints directly through our UI. No code required to create or host or monitor or report on. In turn, they can use the built-in connectors to expose existing systems to the rest of the world as APIs. They can use the built-in workflow and business process automation tools that turn their business requirements into real capabilities. Hence, ESBs, like Neuron, can be used to tie systems together really quickly, acting much like a universal translator. They can be used to automate processes, provide service composition capabilities, reduce the overall development effort. They also allow companies to abstract their back-end processes, systems and services from all their consuming client-facing apps. So that means they can change things quickly without taking down their clients all the time. That's pretty important. So now that we have a better understanding of what an ESB is or can be, how does it differ from traditional integration brokers? Well, it usually comes down to architecture. When most people think about integration architecture, they think about three possible roads to travel down: point to point, hub and spoke, or an ESB. Now, a lot of companies out there are still doing point to point, and that's fair. They're usually either resource constrained, always in put out fire mode, or they simply haven't been exposed to a lot of enterprise integration alternatives. Now, point to point can work great if you have a few applications, but as you add more applications and more modifications, it's harder, it's more time consuming and more expensive. The cost of a change or an addition of a new integration point exponentially grows as more systems are added. And those systems are tightly coupled. So that means when you change something, you tend to break everything as well. Everything needs to know pretty much about the other. Now, hub and spoke has its place, but that can be a little problematic. Typically harder to scale. You get some tight coupling between systems. Then there's the ESB. Scales well, usually less decoupling, and offers a level of abstraction and reuse that others don't. The bus architecture can provide logical centralization, but physical decentralization. Good point for Neuron. We see this in a lot of pub-sub messaging solutions, including the one that Neuron provides. Using Neuron's ESB's hierarchical topic-based pub-sub messaging system, anything can act as a publisher. That means any system, any application, any technology, or API or protocol. And then anything can also act as a subscriber, but one doesn't need to know about the other. And any change on one doesn't affect the other. That means organizations can make changes fairly quickly. Kind of nice. And topics can control where a request is routed, what system gets what, think of it that way. But it can also control the quality of service. So when you start thinking about the business requirements of an applications, do I need durability, reliable messaging? I can never lose an order. Those kind of things becomes important. We're kind of unique here because even the network transport can be configured at the Neuron ESB topic level. In Neuron, we actually support both ESB and hub and spoke technologies because they both play a really important part in enterprise integration. As I said earlier, ESBs have evolved to beyond just mere messaging capabilities. Today, many ESBs, notably Neuron, have evolved into full-blown integration brokers, shipping with pub-sub messaging systems, usually some kind of graphical business process automation tool, some long-running workflow, like Neuron, as well as some service and API mediation hosting capabilities. Not uncommon. So now let's talk a little bit about Neuron ESB and its unique place in the ESB universe. First and foremost, what should stand out for everyone is that Neuron ESB is a full ESB and integration broker, but we're built entirely on the Microsoft.NET platform. Now, we'll talk a little later on why that's important, especially when you want to reduce your development efforts, and most importantly, when you want to be able to leverage your existing skills and your existing assets in the integration world. You know, one of the reasons we created Neuron ESB was really to combat the high costs that so many vendors incur on their customers. Now, historically, the space has been rife with buy $1 of middleware and sign an SOW for $1 million of consulting services. That's primarily where many of the big vendors made their money. Now, unfortunately, this was the norm, not the exception. And to this day, not a lot has changed. Most vendors don't really care if their middleware products are hard to use. Their answer has always been, hire the experts. And by the way, we have plenty of them. So typically after the customer bought the software, they'd have to run out and try to find a small army of consultants who had a PhD in that software and pay top dollar for them. And once you add all this up, any hope of accelerating that time to market equation really gets lost. In fact, a lot of these projects will either turn into failures or extend much longer than they originally planned. And once the consultants left, most of the time the integration broker just turned into shelfware. With Neuron ESB, we really wanted to change the game. We didn't just want to lower the product price point. We wanted to eliminate the need for specialists altogether, or at least reduce that need. We also wanted to reduce the long-term operational costs, since that's where a real bulk of expenses can come from. And we thought if we built something really easy to use, intuitive, and easy to learn so that any junior .NET developer can master it in a matter of days, that would have a real true value for companies that committed to that Microsoft platform. Simplifying everything, starting from development, deployment, setup, configuration, all the way through to operations. What's the result? Solutions built in a fraction of the time for a fraction of the cost. Now, we've proven this model out with our customers, and we've been fairly successful. I'd say probably 70, 75% more never really engage our consulting services. They tend to do the work themselves. Now, what does that mean to you? That means customers get to leverage their own resources or outsource the junior .NET developer resources for a fraction of the cost. More just do the work themselves. And that means they get to market faster. I think we've talked enough about the value of Neuron. Now let's see how we work in the API world. We can bring complex systems together, we can build more agile solutions, and we can expose all this with APIs. Here's an example of how Neuron ESB's integration architecture can be used to tie various systems together. This example uses APIs, application adapters, pub/sub messaging to abstract all the systems and make it available for anyone to call over the web. Now, this slide shows you the process of creating an email campaign in Salesforce and sending those to Marketo. So imagine the user creates an email campaign file using the Salesforce UI. Now, when that's done, it's submitted to Neuron via a Salesforce callout to our Neuron-hosted API. Now, alternatively, the Neuron ESB Salesforce adapter also supports outbound events. So now, if the company didn't want to write custom Apex code, they can certainly configure that as an outbound event within Salesforce. Now, the next part of this is Neuron processes the file, might run a business process, do some intermediate processing on it, and then publishes it to a Neuron topic. Now, Marketo, specifically the Neuron ESB Marketo adapter, subscribes to that message, receives it, processes it. Now, once it finishes, or that is, once Marketo finishes collecting all the responses, it sends a response file back out to Neuron. And Neuron picks this up using the FTP adapter. It processes that file, publishes it right back to a topic, and then the Neuron ESB Salesforce adapter subscribes to it and updates Salesforce. Pretty simple, pretty easy to build out. And that's really the beauty of Neuron. The advantage of using something like Neuron for this, adapters abstract the details of the systems from the developer. They just need to know what the message looks like. It's easy to develop and easy to deploy. You're not writing nearly as much code anymore because the platform provides the delta. And all the security hops can be handled by the adapter. Salesforce and OAuth all handled by the Neuron ESB platform. Once the system endpoints are all set up, they can be reused over and over again or aggregated to build larger, more full-featured capabilities. So lots of reuse in these kind of platforms. And endpoints, whether they're application, SOAP, or API endpoints, they can be easily decoupled by customer applications to talk to. And, a good question we always ask, or what gets asked, is why would you want to decouple them in the first place? If you look at how most developers work with services, they tend to work directly against them. And that creates these tightly coupled proxies, tightly coupled communication between the consuming client application and those back-end services. Now, that's kind of tough because that makes change really, really hard. This means if you make a change to any back-end service, like version them, add new capabilities, change a signature, etc., the developer typically has to recompile all the customer consuming applications that reference the service. A friend of mine used to call this SOAP over RPC. And this happens whether it's REST, SOAP, etc., right? There's always this tight coupling. And ideally what you want to be able to do is eliminate that tight coupling. When you place Neuron ESB as a broker, we can host a generic SOAP or API endpoint. We can expose WSDL. We can expose Swagger, inspect the inbound request document coming in, dynamically route that to back-end services, depending on the source, context, or context. Now, that's kind of important. So imagine Mary comes in from finance. All of a sudden, she can be routed to version 1 of a service or an application. And Joe comes in from HR. Hey, he could be routed to version 3 or version 4 of that same application. Also, since the request is being brokered by Neuron, Neuron can do any mediation in the middle, any enrichment, full-blown process automation. In Neuron, you can actually expose a business process as an API service altogether. And that means now that any change to the back-end systems don't necessitate a change to these front-end customer consuming applications. Now on to some fun stuff with Swagger, APIs, and workflows. Most people are familiar with the idea of service composition. A business process for a company could incorporate a lot of different services. as well as applications as part of their overall process, and in turn, expose that process as some kind of service, either through SOAP or REST API. So to cover this, I thought we'd walk through a sample a bit more complex than that email campaign one we saw earlier. And I think you'll find it's actually a fairly common problem and scenario to solve. So this slide looks a little complicated. There's a lot of things going on, okay? This describes a business flow that a company eventually might need to support. Now, being able to offload long-running processes initiated from an incoming service or API request is kind of important, right? Because you can't hold up a client because a workflow in the background might take minutes, hours, or even days to run. So in this case, I'm using a client registration process to demonstrate this. And we'll show how Neuron can be used to provide all those capabilities. So think of the first step. A user creates and then submits a request via an API. That API is hosted by Neuron and exposed via Swagger. And Swagger is a documentation format for APIs, just like WSDL is a documentation format for SOAP-based services. Now, that request will actually start a real-time business process. In this scenario, we're using the Neuron ESB Business Process Designer as well as the Neuron ESB Workflow Designer. Now, they're both meant to solve two different problems. The Business Process Designer is designed to basically be really fast, work low latency, great for request response type calls. It's a stateless environment. You can design some fairly complex logic in this, right? You can expose it as a web service, but there's no state being maintained in the background. It's meant for fast situations. Now, workflow is designed for long-running scenarios. It's all about state. We'll talk more of that later. So this kicks off the real-time business process. Now, this will go ahead and authenticate the caller against an internal authentication service. Then it registers the user with an internal holding system, kind of a pre-registration process. Now, Neuron takes the registration request, and then asynchronously, we just publish this to a Neuron messaging topic. Now, once that's published, the business process immediately returns a token back to the client registration, and the client's done. As far as he's concerned, pre-registration is complete, it's successful, etc. Now, in the background, publishing that message to that topic, the workflow is actually subscribing to that. And now it's going to run in the background, and that workflow is going to do a lot of things. And it might take time to finish, especially because it has to go out and seek a manual approval. So the workflow subscribes to the registration request. Now, part of this, we've got to first authenticate against Salesforce, then we register within Salesforce, then we update an internal account system using an API with an OAuth provider configured for it. Then we send it out for manual approval. And this is kind of interesting because Neuron Workflow provides for custom correlation. And custom correlation is kind of cool because that means, hey, I can define the uniqueness of this request going out. And maybe this is going out to a warehouse. Maybe this is going out, in this case, a manager for approval. And then when that manager approves, maybe it's a day later, that approval is going to get routed back into the system, okay? And then Neuron is going to intelligently identify that event, that message, and route it back to the correct instance of that workflow that's currently dehydrated in the database. Once Neuron gets it, workflow picks up right where it left off, and it'll finish, register the user. Now, these kind of business flows can be built pretty easily using Neuron ESB. Let's spend a few minutes and decompose this to see how easy it is to build something like this in Neuron ESB. The first step, we created some pretty simple Swagger documentation for our API using the Swagger editor. Next, we just imported it directly into Neuron. Neuron has a repository that supports Swagger documents, WSDL documents, JSON, text, XML, XSL, XML schemas, pretty much most things that you would need for integration work. After that, all we have to do is assign that Swagger document to the API that we configured in the Neuron ESB service broker. And it just shows up as a drop-down box. Now, what does this do? Well, next thing you know, all you have to do is navigate to the browser, put in the URL that we're hosting, And voila, you're actually going to see the Swagger documentation. And hence, you can see it, you can inspect it, see what the calls are going to be, even try it out. Pretty simple to do. So now, once we've created the API in Neuron using the Neuron ESB Explorer, we've added Swagger documentation to it so that any developer can see how to call it and test it out. The next step is really building out the business process that would do all the heavy lifting. Now, the business process itself is lightweight, right? It's designed to be fast, etc. And so Neuron provides a graphical business process editor just for that task. Everything is drag and drop. Just drag it on, configure everything with a property grid. So once that's kicked off, this handles the authentication and pre-registration process. And this calls out to external APIs, and this is using Neuron's service broker capabilities under the hood. Now, I say real time only because the purpose of the process designer is to build processes that are intended to run hard and fast for request response type scenarios. Now, say if I had to call an API, I could actually configure the HTTP properties easily with the Neuron Designer using the HTTP client utility. Now, users can leverage Neuron environmental variables, message properties, constants to configure these. It makes it very easy to move from environment to environment. Now, this process authenticates and pre-registers, but then it publishes the resulting message to a Neuron ESB topic, where a workflow can later subscribe and continue the processing while the user gets his token back. And now the user is disengaged, nothing is holding him up, and this background process is running and may continue to run for hours. So now let's take a look at the workflow. Where business processes were all about speed, being lightweight, no state management, workflow is just the opposite. They are all about state. They're long running. They can be restarted where they left off. They really provide all the business resiliency you need, and they provide some pretty cool tracking. They also support custom correlation of events. Now that's handy when you're doing these manual type of approvals, or anytime you have to send out something and wait for a response before you continue to the next event. And once that event comes in, the correct instance of workflow gets loaded out from the database, starts back up where it left off. This workflow's job is to handle authenticating and registering with Salesforce, updating other third-party systems via APIs and adapters, and sending the request out for the manager's approval, and then waiting until that approval comes back in to continue processing. Now, at any time, the workflow tracking system can be queried to see what the state of everything is. Any workflow tracking entry can be opened to view the details of the event, where you can view all the state, the messages, how long each step took, and what step it's waiting on. It's pretty cool. You can actually click on the individual tracking events, and they'll be in sync with the visual workflow, so you can see step by step how this process executed. And you can also see where it's waiting. If there's an error, you'll see a red line. You can double click on it, inspect the error. You can open up any message that was generated. You can edit and resubmit those messages. So pretty powerful. We've spent a good deal of time now on what an ESB is, what it can provide, as well as some of the interesting scenarios using the out-of-the-box service and adapter capabilities. So let's spend some time on extensibility. And this is kind of important for us, especially being built on the Microsoft platform. And it's a differentiator for Neuron ESB. So why is this so important? Because integration brokers like Neuron have essentially become horizontal development platforms that companies build custom, sometimes vertically focused solutions on top of. We've already talked about the services and the infrastructure that Neuron provides. Those are services and infrastructure that can be readily deployed and leveraged in any development effort. Now, I've always believed that regardless of the industry you're in, all customers share a common set of problems when it comes to integration. But it's almost impossible to anticipate every need, be able to support every system out of the box. Hence, ESBs and integration brokers have to be first and foremost extensible through customization supported by the product. And as integration scenarios get more complex, customizations seem to always be necessary. We really need three things for developers to be not just effective, but also productive at making customizations. First, it's got to follow an agile approach, since that's the way most developers work. Now, that means things like being type agnostic, limiting references, a self-aware runtime, supporting Xcopy deployment, simulation, and debugging capabilities. Nothing's worse when the developer has to spend days just trying to determine if some customization they wrote actually works or not, especially when the customization itself may have been only 2 lines of code. Now, this is one of the main reasons why developers don't like to work with these types of processes. Too much time banging their head against a wall, and they tend to be far too obtuse. Also, they tend to be very, very hard to extend. Now, second, extensibility needs to be accessible. Now, what does that mean? It means that you need to be able to make the customizations where they would be the most effective and cost the least amount of effort and time. And lastly, jump into this again, they've got to be easy to use. And this should go without saying. However, I've heard horror stories about customers attempting to write adapters to systems and other products. When I was with Microsoft, we gave up on the thought that a customer would ever be able to write a BizTalk adapter. It truly had to have a PhD in the product to be effective. And that's a challenge that a lot of these vendors have today, is that writing any of these extensibility points, especially custom adapters, tends to be a monumental effort. They tend to end up spending months doing this kind of effort. And with Neuron, we've really simplified a lot of these things. Our goal was to make it so that it was incredibly friendly for any .NET developer to learn and pick up. Most of our interfaces are all about one interface, one method, and that's it. So let's talk about some of the extensibility points in Neuron. There's actually quite a few, which include adapters, connectors, APIs, service endpoints, business processes, and workflows. With Neuron ESB, we support the ability to build custom adapters and connectors. So although Neuron ships with dozens of these to cover every commodity transport and protocol and database and queue, and as well as most line of business systems like Salesforce and NetSuite, SAP and Dynamics Online, Great Plains, etc., building a custom adapter is really a necessary requirement, and it needs to be easy. It needs to be intuitive, and it can't be obtuse. As I said, these tend to be horizontal platforms, right? You can't possibly anticipate every system that someone might need to connect to. So being able to easily build this out is incredibly important. Now, adapters also have to be powerful. And that's why some adapters, like some of the ones that we ship now with Marketo and Dynamics CRM, SAP, NetSuite, they all support some concept of metadata. So it makes it easy for the developer. And developers can even expose this with the adapter framework, where they can expose metadata to make it easy for other developers to connect to their systems. Now, the metadata wizard will auto-generate schemas for you, sample XML documents, even sample JSON documents. Takes a lot of the guesswork out for that developer. Now, another way to extend the system is when you're using APIs. Now, that might be SOAP endpoints or REST API endpoints. Now, with Neuron, what's nice about it is we're built on the Microsoft Windows Communication Foundation when it comes to our service broker. And so that means when you're using SOAP, any WCF extensibility point works with us. You can use custom bindings, custom behaviors, custom configuration. All those work. You can import in your own WSDL. When you're using REST, you can import your own Swagger in, supporting JSON and everything else. So it makes it very, very easy to make these work with any system built. The business process designer and workflow designer, both extensible solutions. The beauty of the business process designer and the workflow designer, you're never compiling anything in an assembly. Yet, you can access .NET assemblies directly within the process designer and the workflow designer. Kind of nice. Within these, you can directly write C# code, JavaScript code, VB.NET. And what's nice about this, you've got the full IntelliSense. You don't have to compile anything into assembly. You just hit apply and save. So Neuron's kind of cool where we dynamically compile everything at runtime, and we're self-aware, so we can detect if anything's been modified. And if it is, we recompile again. So developer doesn't have to go through any kind of crazy deployment process. And that also means custom process stuff, just like custom workflow activities, easily built. With Neuron, it's literally one interface, and they're self-registering. Just compile, you drop into a folder. Pretty easy to do. Well, that was all I had for you folks, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Love to hear any questions.
Marty, fantastic session. I think a lot of people's eyes were really open to see how Neuron ESB and a lot of the thinking you put behind it have really made ESBs quite extensible, even for these new, highly agile, highly in-demand digital business projects. Really great session.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, Vance.
You know, Marty, let's start with a top-line proposition here. Just to bring people into your thinking at Neuron ESB and how you've taken some real steps to deliver some really useful architectures and solutions. You know, some folks say that ESBs remain useful for traditional enterprise integrations, but on their own, they're not really up to the needs of some of these newer style integrations that are out there for the digital business. What are people missing?
Well, I think this comes back to the question of how ESBs have evolved. There's quite a few out there that haven't evolved, but many have evolved into those full-blown integration brokers. If you look at something like Neuron, I mean, we're used for on-premise integration. We're also used for a lot of cloud integration. We have companies now doing some massive projects with hybrid integration. We have one of the largest international charities on the planet actually using us to tie in Salesforce, NetSuite with all their internal systems, and also handling all the partner connectivity and integration with basically the partners that they deal with all over the world feeding children. We have a very large government agency outside of the US rebuilding their entire passport system on top of Neuron ESB. And that was, I think, a $150 million project. So again, I think a lot of it's just about where ESBs have evolved. And as I said, some haven't. Others like us, we have. We actually provide service brokering capabilities, cloud capabilities, actual stateful workflow. A lot of the vendors today in our space don't actually offer stateful workflow. You know, they just offer more of that real-time business process kind of capability that we have with our process designer. And we also handle all the connectivity plus the pub sub messaging. So it's quite a slew of features.
You know, it's really worth another drill down question here, Marty, and here's one right here. It points to your email campaign example. It sounds like from the example given that the speaker says that we don't need to buy a separate iPaaS or API management solution. Is that true?
Well, let's put it this way. I think more and more customers are expecting the integration broker to actually have some really full-fledged API management features to it. A lot of API management really handles more of how you would say, sometimes it's obviously creating APIs. They don't necessarily work with SOAP very well. There's some that do. But they don't really handle all the other things required for integration or building complex solutions, right? They tend to be more really around API management and governance. Neuron today does some API management, not a lot. The platform we're releasing at the end of the year, though, will be a full-service API management system included with Neuron ESB. I just keep on hearing it from my customers, right? They don't want to use two products because when you think about it, what are you doing? You're putting a proxy in front of a proxy, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So architecturally, having two products, not necessarily the best solution, but many do because most of the API management products out there don't have the corresponding integration, the workflow, and all the other cool things that you really need to be effective in the enterprise.
And let's drill into the iPaaS part of the equation. You mentioned, Marty, that you have pre-written adapters for Salesforce, Marketo, and several other popular cloud services, right? Give us some detail of how folks are using that in conjunction with Neuron ESB.
Wow. We've actually built some fairly robust connectivity with things like Marketo and Dynamics Online, and as well as Salesforce. We have quite a few customers today using Salesforce as kind of almost primary CRM system, but it's really tying Salesforce in with the rest of their other internal systems, that on-premise integration. They want to capture events that happen in Salesforce, and as they happen, propagate those events to things like SAP or NetSuite.
Fantastic. You know, another theme that comes in from the questions, Marty, is this idea of getting developers more interested in ESBs. As you know from years in the business, that the integration broker or the ESB used to just be an endpoint the developer really didn't care too much about. He would just drop something off into it and let the middle piece take care of the rest. So the question to that point of view says, does Neuron ESB offer some guidance or wizard to help walk developers through how to achieve this great outcome?
So yeah, at the end of the day, it's easy to configure an API, host an endpoint in Neuron. I mean, it's 30 seconds worth of work. I mean, you just configure it right through our UI, but someone still has to build the middle piece, the workflow or the process, those kind of screenshots that I gave you. And we actually provide tutorials on our website. If you go to www.neuronesb.com under resources, you'll actually see several tutorials. We're actually currently building some web-based training right now. We're hoping to have that up there in a few months. But we also ship about 50 or 60 different samples right now with the product. Our goal was to, again, make people very productive. Our samples browser will automatically set up the configuration, load it for you, open up any kind of Visual Studio samples, and literally all you have to do is like hit a run button to see things work. So we try to make that a fairly painless process.
This has just been fantastic. Just to give folks a sense of the productivity and the efficiencies that you talked about, can you share an idea about how more quickly integrations can be put out there and tested by LOB and actually adopted and used, thanks to the approach that you've got, where you've brought together the .NET developer community with the ways to do integration?
Well, we worked with a large media company that had long roots with TIBCO and Oracle, and they still do. But they had one IT group, a very big one, that was all .NET. I mean, there's basically two big media companies, and this is one of them. And the challenge that this group always had was that every time they had an integration project, they'd have to go to the internal group, and every estimate was always 12 or 18 months to get it done. So they thought it might be a good candidate for Neuron. We got the project done in 3 weeks, which is great. They ended up adopting Neuron. And I think the first year they got 9 different projects on the bus, which is great because you don't see that with anybody. We have customers that deploy solutions, literally deploy every 2 months, new projects. And again, you don't typically see that with other vendors.
You know, Marty, so many cool features, not just for the actual .NET developer community itself, but all these architects and integration folks that are dealing with tons of different integration projects, both for cloud and other environments. How would you suggest people take the next step and get a better hands-on feel for Neuron ESB? Is there a demo or maybe even a free trial they can get involved with?
Sure. Actually, if they go up to our website at www.neuronesb.com, they can download a 30-day evaluation copy. They can go through our tutorials and our samples and ping us on our support alias, and we'd be more than happy to also help them.
Marty Wasznicky, Vice President, Neuron ESB. This has been a fantastic session, and I think it's really opened a lot of people's eyes about the flexibility and the extensibility of ESB technology right now in empowering developers to do some of these very high-value integrations. A really great session.
Well, thank you very much.
And as we love to do here at Enterprise Integration Summit, Marty mentioned several different types of resources, including that click to the free trial. We're going to summarize all those in this great slide here for kind of a one-slide access to all of the Neuron ESB resources. So thanks again, everyone.